What Moscow did this week crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with precision, audacity, and something the world has never seen before. A ghost army that has left Russian commanders scrambling and Western analysts speechless. Tonight we unpack everything: the Kremlin's mastermind, Ukraine's revolutionary response, and why Washington is now, for the first time since this war began, genuinely asking for dialogue. For 18 months now, there had been whispers, not official briefings, not formal intelligence assessments, just whispers, that Russia was preparing something fundamentally different. Moscow has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a doctrine. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this spring was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators: the sudden increase in encrypted traffic between Moscow and frontline commanders, the unusual movement of senior officers away from their normal postings, the procurement of specialized equipment through third-party channels, the sudden silence from units that had been actively engaged for months. All of that went quiet in late April, and whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western intelligence agencies increased surveillance, satellite coverage was expanded, human intelligence assets were activated across 3 continents, but nothing prepared them for what emerged on May 14th. Early Tuesday morning, NATO intelligence detected what they described as a fundamental restructuring of Russian command architecture, including the elevation of a figure who had not been publicly associated with the Ukraine operation in over 14 months. These are the kinds of personnel moves that Moscow only makes when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive, a strategic pivot, or preparation for a conflict expansion. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its entire war posture. And when a nuclear power shifts war posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every capital from Washington to Tokyo pays attention. The figure who emerged has been identified in classified briefings as General Dmitry Volkov, a name that had largely disappeared from public view after early 2024. Volkov, according to sources who spoke with Western media under strict anonymity, was the architect of Russia's most successful operations in Syria. He was responsible for the integration of electronic warfare, cyber operations, and conventional military force in ways that caught Western militaries off guard. But what made his re-emergence so alarming wasn't his past. It was what intelligence agencies believe he's been doing for the past 18 months. They call it Project 2026. And tonight, we're learning just how ambitious that project really is. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Russia's move as destabilizing, unprecedented in the context of this conflict, and perhaps most importantly, designed to fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war before the 2026 timeline that Western planners had been counting on. But strategic surprise only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most sophisticated and unexpected we've seen in modern warfare. Here's what we know. Within 36 hours of the first intelligence confirming Volkov's elevation, Ukraine activated what sources are calling Operation Phantom Grid. These weren't the conventional drone strikes or artillery barrages we've become accustomed to. These were coordinated deception operations, integrated systems of decoys, electronic warfare platforms, and AI-driven false signatures that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. Military analysts are calling it the Ghost Army, and tonight that Ghost Army is active across 4 sectors of the front. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated operations on Russian logistics networks, including a command hub near Belgorod that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was Volkov's new operational headquarters. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its new command structure. They hit communications nodes, they hit ammunition depots, they hit staging areas that were likely preparing to support the first phase of whatever Volkov had planned. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's 2026 strategy, the infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's command restructuring wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of strategic evolution that could fundamentally change the war's dynamics if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't broadcast their intentions. They didn't wait for Western approval. They hit the right targets at the right time. They hit the logistics before they could be dispersed. But what made Ukraine's response truly remarkable wasn't just the strikes, it was the ghost army that accompanied them. According to reports from multiple defense sources, Ukraine deployed an integrated network of decoy systems, electronic emitters, and AI-controlled false signatures across a 200-kilometer front. Russian radar systems detected what appeared to be massive troop movements. Russian satellite coverage showed what looked like armor concentrations. Russian signals intelligence picked up what seemed like command communications. None of it was real. The Ghost Army created phantom formations so convincing that Russian commanders diverted significant resources to counter threats that didn't exist. While Russia chased ghosts, Ukraine's real forces struck with devastating precision. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's activation of Volkov and Project 2026 was designed to test the resilience of Ukrainian command structures after months of grinding attrition warfare. Moscow wanted to see whether Kyiv would panic, whether they would make hasty decisions, whether the strain of nearly 3 years of war had finally degraded their strategic thinking. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't panic. They executed a response that was so coordinated, so technologically sophisticated, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But this week, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's Volkov appointment as escalation signaling, a way to project strength and force the West into negotiating from a position of fear. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their operations were not only effective, they were executed precisely that multiple Russian units reportedly abandoned positions they had held for months, fearing they were about to be encircled by forces that existed only as electromagnetic signatures. That psychological element matters because it shows something crucial. It shows that Ukraine is not merely surviving, they are innovating, they are not waiting to be acted upon. They are actively shaping the battlefield in ways that neither Moscow nor Washington fully anticipated. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian cyber units carried out coordinated attacks on Russian military communications, forcing commanders to switch to backup systems that were slower and less secure. Ukrainian special operations forces targeted logistics convoys that had been assembled in the last 72 hours, specifically to support Volkov's new command structure. Ukrainian drone operators working from locations deep behind the front lines reportedly disabled early warning systems used by Russia to coordinate air defense across the eastern sectors. This wasn't just tactical harassment. This wasn't just battlefield disruption. This was strategic decapitation. This was operational paralysis. And operational paralysis is the one thing Russia has struggled to prevent since the war's earliest days. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their ability to consolidate gains. For every new general Moscow appoints, Kyiv finds a way to disrupt their command authority before it can take root. The Ghost Army represents the next evolution of this strategy. Remember, Moscow thought the war would be over in weeks. They thought Ukraine's military would collapse under initial pressure. They thought Western support would fade as the conflict dragged on. They thought time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine's military is more sophisticated than it was 2 years ago. Western support, while strain, continues to flow. And Russia's latest strategic gambit, the elevation of Volkov and Project 2026, has been disrupted before it could even begin. The historical parallel that analysts are drawing is to the Allied deception operations of World War II, operations like Fortitude, which convinced German commanders that the D-Day invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. Ukraine's Ghost Army represents the 21st century evolution of that doctrine. But instead of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, Ukraine is using AI, autonomous systems, and electronic warfare to create illusions so convincing that they are fundamentally reshaping how Russia can operate. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under unprecedented pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want escalation, pragmatists want negotiation, military commanders want resources they aren't receiving. Oligarchs want economic stability they cannot achieve under sanctions. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has lasted far longer and cost far more than anyone in the Kremlin anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The appointment of Volkov, a figure associated with Russia's most aggressive and unconventional operations, signals that Putin is looking for a dramatic shift. He needs something to change. He needs something to point to as justification for the sacrifices Russia has made, and Project 2026, whatever its full scope, was designed to provide that justification. But tonight, Ukraine is demonstrating that they have no intention of allowing that plan to unfold unchallenged. Washington's statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow this conflict to escalate beyond current boundaries. Officials said plainly that Russia's command restructuring was inconsistent with stated commitments to de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to pretend otherwise. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. But what was perhaps more notable was the second part of Washington's message, the part directed at Kyiv. According to sources familiar with the communications, U.S. officials privately urged Ukraine to exercise restraint in their response to Russia's moves. They asked for consultation before major operations. They requested advance notice of significant strikes. In other words, Washington asked Ukraine to coordinate more closely, and Kyiv apparently declined. The Ghost Army was activated without prior approval from Washington. The strikes on Russian logistics networks were executed without waiting for American blessing. Ukraine made clear that while they value Western support, they will not subordinate their survival to Western timelines. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a measured, defiant speech tonight. He said, "They send their generals, we send our ghosts. Let them chase shadows while we secure our future. He said, Ukraine does not need permission to defend itself. We need only the will, and that will has never been stronger. And he said, to those who ask us to wait, to those who ask us to consult, I say this, we have been waiting for 3 years. We will wait no longer. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's message was clear. Ukraine will act in its own interest, with or without prior coordination. And tonight that message was heard in every capital that matters. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with Volkov's elevation, Belarus has increased military exercises along its southern border. Russian naval assets in the Black Sea have adopted more aggressive patrol patterns. Cyber attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure have increased threefold in the past 2 weeks. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Question Western analysts are now asking is whether this represents the opening phase of a summer offensive, a pressure campaign designed to force negotiations, or something else entirely. The answer may depend on what happens in the next 14 days. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a major offensive designed to achieve territorial gains before any potential political changes in Washington. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create conditions for negotiations by demonstrating renewed military capability. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish escalation dominance, creating a situation where the West feels compelled to restrain Ukraine rather than risk wider conflict. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't defer to Western concerns. They didn't allow Russia to dictate the tempo of events. They responded with a ghost army, demonstrating that any Russian escalation will be met with Ukrainian innovation. What we're watching now is a test of strategic will. Russia wants to see whether the West will pressure Ukraine into restraint. Ukraine wants to show that they remain capable of independent action, regardless of external pressure. Washington wants to prevent escalation beyond current boundaries, and Moscow wants to prevent Ukraine from demonstrating that Russian initiatives can be countered before they begin. The next 2 weeks will reveal which of these objectives prevails. Tonight we've heard from NATO officials who are now monitoring Russian force movements in real time. They say that several Russian units have halted their advance, apparently uncertain whether they're facing real Ukrainian forces or elements of the Ghost Army. They say that Russian communications have become erratic, suggesting significant command confusion. And they say Russia's decision to elevate Volkov is likely part of a broader strategy intended to project strength while buying time for internal reorganization. But Ukraine is not waiting. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating. Their response today, precise, innovative, and unapologetic, sent a message to Moscow that escalation will be matched. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine will not be managed. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with Project 2026. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian planning before it could mature. It demonstrated capabilities that Moscow had not anticipated. And it reminded the world that Ukraine remains a capable, innovative, and determined actor in this conflict. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 14 days. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. If they pause to reassess, Ukraine has already shown they are prepared to exploit any hesitation. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that the Ghost Army is real, it is effective, and it is only the beginning of what Ukraine is capable of deploying. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have understood from the beginning. Ukraine will not be intimidated. Ukraine will not be managed. And Ukraine will not wait for permission to secure its own survival. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The Ghost Army has changed the calculus. Washington's calls for restraint have been politely declined. And Russia's 2026 Mastermind has already lost his first battle. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.